King Charles is going to hold a royal summit to lay out the future of the monarchy.
And, as every member of my family can testify,
the meeting was called without warning and attended without question. No official reason was given, but every senior royal summoned to that room already knew what it was about. Camilla had made her threat, and Charles had no choice but to respond. The summit nobody was supposed to know about. There are moments in the life of any institution when the carefully maintained fiction of stability becomes impossible to sustain. When the internal pressures that have been building beneath the surface for months or years finally reach a point where they can no longer be managed through the usual tools of strategic silence, carefully worded statements, and the studied composure of people trained from birth to Project Calm in the face of crisis. For the British royal family, that moment arrived in the early months of 2025, and the evidence of it was a meeting that was never supposed to become public knowledge, summoned with unusual urgency, conducted behind closed doors, and attended by senior members of the royal family who understood from the moment they received the call that what was about to be discussed was not a matter of routine palace business. The emergency family summit called by King Charles was not announced through official channels. There was no press release issued by Buckingham Palace. No royal correspondent received the customary tip-off that a significant gathering was being convened. The meeting existed in the language of palace management, entirely off the record, and yet, within days of its occurrence, whispers about what had taken place began circulating through the inner circles of those who follow the monarchy closely. Sources familiar with the situation describe a gathering characterized by an atmosphere of unusual tension, one in which the normal protocols of royal family meetings, the careful observance of hierarchy, the measured exchange of pleasantries before the business of the day begins, were notably compressed. Those present understood that time was short and that the matter at hand was serious enough to dispense with the usual courtesies. Who exactly was summoned to that meeting is a question that insiders have answered only in fragments. What sources confirm is that the gathering included senior working royals, whose counsel the king trusts in moments of institutional crisis. What is equally telling, according to those with knowledge of the situation, is who was not in the room. The meeting was not a full family gathering of the kind that occurs at key moments in the royal calendar. It was selective, deliberately so. The people Charles chose to summon were not chosen randomly or out of simple convenience. They were chosen because they represented the closest thing the king has to a trusted inner council, people whose discretion he relies upon and whose loyalty he believes, rightly or wrongly, to be unambiguous. The urgency of the summons itself was, according to sources, deeply unusual. Senior royals are accustomed to receiving requests for their presence at palace gatherings with reasonable advance notice. The machinery of royal scheduling is elaborate and carefully maintained, and disruptions to it are taken seriously precisely because they signal that something has shifted outside the boundaries of normal palace life. When the calls went out for this particular meeting, insiders say the notice given was short enough to register immediately as significant. People rearranged commitments, travel plans were adjusted. The message embedded in the brevity of the notice was understood before a single word of explanation was offered. Something had happened that required an immediate response. What had happened, according to sources close to the situation, was that Camilla had communicated something to the king that he could not allow to sit unaddressed. The precise form of that communication is described differently by different sources. Some say it was delivered in the course of a private conversation between husband and wife, one of those exchanges that begins in the ordinary register of domestic life and then shifts without warning into territory that neither party can easily step back from. Others suggest that the message was conveyed through intermediaries, in the careful and indirect way that serious intentions are sometimes transmitted within the royal household, when the directness of a face-to-face conversation carries too much risk of immediate escalation. What every source agrees on is the substance of what was communicated. Camilla had files. She had held them for a long time, and she was prepared, under certain conditions, to see their contents brought into the light. For Charles, a man who has spent his entire adult life managing the relationship between private reality and public image, the implications of that communication were immediate and visceral. The monarchy's power rests more than any other single factor on the public's continued willingness to extend it a degree of trust and deference that is not automatically granted to other institutions. That willingness is fragile. It has been tested repeatedly over the decades by scandals, divorces, and public controversies that have each taken their toll on the relationship between the crown and the people it serves. Charles knows that history intimately. He lived through the most damaging chapters of it, and he understands better than most that the institution's capacity to absorb further damage is not unlimited. The emergency summit was therefore not simply a response to a marital dispute or a personal disagreement between a husband and wife navigating the particular pressures of life at the top of the monarchy. It was a response to a threat that Charles assessed as carrying genuine institutional risk. The people he summoned to that room were not there to offer emotional support or to help him process a difficult moment in his marriage. They were there because the king needed to think through, with people he trusted, what the existence of those files meant, what their potential release could do, and what options were available to him in responding to a situation that had moved with uncomfortable speed from the private to the potentially very public. What those files are alleged to contain, and why their existence represents such a serious threat to the stability of the monarchy, is the question that everything else in this story turns on. The secret files and what they reportedly contain. There is a long tradition within the British royal family of carefully managing information, not simply in the sense that press offices issue statements and communications teams shape narratives, though they do both of those things with considerable sophistication. The management of information within the monarchy operates at a far deeper level than that. It is woven into the culture of the institution itself, into the unspoken understandings between the people who inhabit its inner circles, into the elaborate system of discretion and loyalty that has allowed the House of Windsor to survive decades of scandal, controversy, and public scrutiny without ever fully surrendering the details of what actually happens behind its closed doors. Documents are managed carefully. Correspondence is treated as sensitive by default. And the people who accumulate knowledge of the family's most private affairs understand, almost universally, that what they know is not theirs to share. Camilla Parker Bowles has spent more time inside the innermost circle of the British royal family than almost any living person outside of it by blood. Her relationship with King Charles stretches back to the early 1970s, predating his first marriage, surviving it, outlasting the most hostile period of public opinion toward her, and eventually emerging as the defining romantic relationship of his life. That longevity is not simply a love story, it is also an archive, a woman who has been present in one capacity or another at the center of the most consequential private moments of the modern monarchy. For more than 5 decades, has inevitably accumulated a depth of knowledge about the family, its internal dynamics, its private decisions, and its most carefully guarded vulnerabilities that very few people on Earth can match. The files that sources say Camilla possesses are not, according to those familiar with the situation, a single collection of documents assembled for a specific purpose. They are better understood as the accumulated record of a lifetime spent at the intersection of personal intimacy and institutional power. Sources describe them as comprising several categories of sensitive material. Personal correspondence is said to feature prominently. Letters and written communications exchanged over decades between senior members of the royal family that reflect the unguarded private views of people who are required, in their public lives, to maintain positions of studied neutrality on matters of enormous consequence. The gap between what certain royals have said privately in correspondence and what they have presented publicly is, according to insiders who claim knowledge of the file's contents, considerable. Beyond personal correspondence, sources suggest the files contain records of private conversations and agreements reached during some of the most sensitive periods in the modern monarchy's history. The years surrounding the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, the period of intense internal negotiation that preceded Camilla's formal acceptance into the royal family, and the complex discussions that took place in the lead-up to her marriage to Charles in April of 2005 are all said to be represented in the material she holds. Those were periods during which commitments were made, assurances were given, and understandings were reached between individuals whose subsequent public positions have not always been entirely consistent with what was privately agreed. The documentation of those inconsistencies in the hands of someone willing to make them public would be extraordinarily damaging. There are also, according to sources who speak with particular care about this aspect of the files, records that touch on financial matters and on decisions made regarding the management of royal estates and assets during the transition between the late Queen's reign and the current one. The period surrounding a monarch's death and the accession of a successor is one of the most sensitive in institutional terms, a moment when decisions are made quickly, often under enormous pressure, and not always with the degree of formal process that might apply under less urgent circumstances. Sources suggest that some of the decisions made during that transitional period are reflected in documents that Camilla holds, and that their contents would raise serious questions about the conduct of certain individuals whose public reputations rest significantly on an image of institutional propriety. What makes the files particularly powerful as a form of leverage is not simply their content, but their provenance. These are not the claims of a disgruntled former employee or the allegations of a media source working from secondhand information. They are, if the accounts of those familiar with them are accurate, primary documents created and exchanged by the principals themselves. Their authenticity would be extremely difficult to challenge, and in an environment where the palace's standard response to uncomfortable revelations is to question the credibility of the source, the existence of documentary evidence created by the family's own members removes the most reliable line of defense the institution possesses. Insiders say Charles's reaction when the existence and potential release of these files was communicated to him reflected an immediate understanding of what they represented. He did not, according to sources, respond with disbelief or with the kind of dismissive confidence that might suggest he considered the threat an empty one. He responded, "Say those familiar with the situation, as a man who knew exactly what was in those files because he had been present for the creation of much of the material they contained." His response was not that of someone being confronted with an allegation he could credibly deny. It was the response of someone being reminded of things he had hoped would remain permanently buried. The question that the emergency summit was convened to address was therefore not whether the threat was real. That was already understood. The question was what to do about it, and answering that question required Charles to bring together the people he trusted most, and to think through with considerable urgency how the monarchy navigates a moment when the person holding its most sensitive secrets is not an outsider but the woman wearing its second most important crown. That conversation and the fault lines it exposed within the family is where the story becomes even more complicated. The marriage behind the crown, Charles and Camilla's hidden power struggle. There is a version of the Charles and Camilla love story that the world has largely accepted. It is the version in which two people who belonged together from the beginning were kept apart by circumstance, duty, and the unforgiving machinery of public opinion, only to find their way back to each other and build, in the later chapters of their lives, something genuine and enduring. It is a compelling narrative, and like all compelling narratives, it contains enough truth to be believable while obscuring enough complexity to be misleading. Because the relationship between King Charles and Queen Camilla has never been simply a love story. It has also, particularly since his accession in September of 2022, become something considerably more complicated. It has become a negotiation over power, and that negotiation, sources say, has been growing more fraught with every passing month. The shift began, according to those who observed it closely, almost immediately after the king's accession. In the years when Charles was Prince of Wales and Camilla was Duchess of Cornwall, the architecture of their relationship was relatively straightforward. He was the heir. She was his partner. His position within the institution was defined by waiting, and hers was defined by supporting him through that wait. The dynamic between them, whatever its private complexities, had a clear external structure that both understood and operated within. But accession changes everything. When Charles became king, the institution that had previously existed as the backdrop to their relationship suddenly became the stage on which every aspect of their lives was performed. And on that stage, the question of who held influence and how it was exercised became considerably more loaded than it had ever been before. Camilla's transition from Duchess of Cornwall to Queen Consort was, on the surface, a straightforward elevation. In practice, insiders say, it represented a fundamental shift in the internal dynamics of the royal household. As Queen Consort, Camilla acquired not just a title, but a platform, a staff, and an institutional legitimacy that gave her influence a formal weight it had previously lacked. She moved, in the space of a single day, from being the king's partner to being the second most senior figure in the monarchy, and she brought to that position, sources say, a very clear sense of what she intended to do with it. What Charles perhaps did not fully anticipate was the degree to which Camilla's institutional ambitions would occasionally pull against his own. He is, by the accounts of those who know him well, a man with deeply held views about how the monarchy should be run, what it should represent, and how its internal affairs should be managed. Those views were formed over decades of preparation for a role he waited longer than any predecessor to assume. And while his love for Camilla is not in question, his willingness to defer to her judgment on matters he considers central to the integrity of his reign has, insiders say, proven more limited than she anticipated. The tension between them has expressed itself in a series of disagreements over access, influence, and the management of the king's inner circle that have been building quietly since the early period of the reign. Camilla's instinct, according to sources, has been to consolidate, to bring the people she trusts into positions of proximity to the center of power, and to ensure that her own influence over the king's decisions is protected and reinforced by the structures around him. Charles's instinct, equally strong, has been to maintain the boundaries of his institutional authority and to resist what he has occasionally experienced as an encroachment on decisions that he believes are properly his alone to make. The files, in that context, are not simply a weapon that emerged from nowhere. They are the ultimate expression of a power dynamic that has been shifting and straining for years. When every other avenue for asserting her position had been met with resistance, Camilla reached for the one form of leverage that could not be managed through the usual channels of palace diplomacy. And in doing so, she forced a confrontation that has exposed just how divided the loyalties within the royal family have quietly become. Who stands with Charles and who stands with Camilla? One of the most enduring myths about the British royal family is that it operates as a unified body, that beneath the occasional public disagreement or the carefully managed revelation of private tension, there exists a bedrock of shared purpose and mutual loyalty that ultimately holds the institution together, regardless of what pressures are applied to it from within or without. It is a myth the palace works very hard to maintain, and it is, according to those with genuine knowledge of how the family actually functions, precisely that, a myth. The reality of the modern House of Windsor is a family divided along lines of loyalty, interest, and personal allegiance that shift and recalibrate in response to the changing distribution of power within the institution, and the crisis triggered by Camilla's threat and Charles's emergency summit has made those divisions more visible than they have been at any point in recent memory. The question of who stands with Charles and who stands with Camilla is not one that can be answered with simple lists of names. Loyalty within the royal family is rarely absolute and almost never publicly declared. It expresses itself instead through the subtler language of access, through whose calls are returned promptly and whose are allowed to wait, through which relationships are visibly maintained and which are allowed to cool through the careful choreography of public appearances that signals to those who know how to read it, where the real lines of allegiance are currently drawn. But beneath that careful subtlety, sources say, the outlines of two distinct camps have become increasingly discernible in the months since the emergency summit was convened. In Charles's corner, insiders identify a group of senior royals and trusted household figures whose primary loyalty is to the institution of the monarchy itself, and to the king's authority as its head. Prince Edward is described by multiple sources as one of the most significant figures in this group. His long-standing reservations about Camilla's expanding influence, his deep personal commitment to the integrity of the institutional boundaries that define how the monarchy operates, and his history of quiet but consistent resistance to what he views as the overreach of Camilla's inner circle, all position him as a natural ally for a king who feels that the balance of power within his own household has shifted uncomfortably far in his wife's direction. Edward does not wear his allegiances publicly, but those who know him say that in private, his position on the current crisis is unambiguous. Princess Anne is also identified by sources as someone whose sympathies in this conflict lie primarily with the institutional framework that Charles represents, rather than with the personal network that Camilla has built. Anne's relationship with Camilla has always been, by the accounts of those who have observed it closely, one of functional respect rather than genuine warmth. She is a woman who has spent her entire adult life in service to the institution, and who has little patience for what she views as the introduction of personal agendas into the machinery of the monarchy. The idea of sensitive royal documents being used as leverage in a private dispute is, according to sources familiar with Anne's views, precisely the kind of development she finds most antithetical to everything she believes the monarchy should represent. Camilla's camp, by contrast, is built on a different kind of loyalty. It is loyalty that is more personal, more emotionally grounded, and in some cases more recently acquired than the institutional allegiances that characterize the King's Corner. Tom Parker Bowles remains, despite his removal from Sandringham, the most trusted figure in his mother's immediate circle. His loyalty to Camilla is total, and his understanding of her position within the institution is sophisticated enough to make him a genuinely valuable advisor in a crisis of this nature. Beyond Tom, sources identify a small number of courtiers and household staff whose careers and positions are sufficiently tied to Camilla's continued influence that their allegiance to her cause is effectively structural rather than merely personal. The more surprising element of the loyalty picture, according to insiders, involves figures whose positions might have been expected to align more clearly with one side or the other, but who have instead adopted a posture of studied neutrality. Several senior members of the extended royal family, sources say, have been careful to avoid any action or statement that could be read as a declaration of allegiance in either direction. This neutrality is not, insiders emphasize, born of indifference. It is a strategic calculation made by people who understand that the outcome of this conflict is not yet determined, and that committing too visibly to either camp before that outcome becomes clear carries significant risks for their own long-term positions within the institution. The position of the Prince and Princess of Wales is one that sources discuss with particular care. William and Catherine occupy a unique position in this crisis. As the heir and his wife, they have a direct and overriding interest in the stability of the institution that transcends the immediate dispute between Charles and Camilla. William's relationship with his father is described by those close to the situation as genuinely warm, but also carefully boundaried, shaped by the painful history of his parents' marriage and by his own hard-won understanding of how quickly the institution can be damaged by the exposure of its private conflicts. Sources say William has been deeply reluctant to be drawn into the current dispute in any way that could be interpreted as taking sides. His priority, insiders emphasize, is the monarchy's long-term stability and his own family's position within it. And that priority sits uncomfortably with the idea of publicly aligning with either his father or his stepmother in a conflict that has the potential to do serious damage regardless of how it resolves. What the current alignment of loyalties reveals, more than anything else, is the degree to which the emergency summit failed to achieve the unity that Charles had presumably hoped it would produce. Instead of drawing the family together around a shared response to a shared threat, it appears to have clarified, and in some cases deepened, the divisions that already existed. And those divisions, sources warn, have created precisely the kind of institutional vulnerability that the files in Camilla's possession are most dangerous in exploiting. The weight of secrets inside the House of Windsor. The British monarchy has always run on secrets. That is not a cynical observation. It is a structural reality of an institution that has survived for centuries by maintaining a careful and deliberate separation between what it shows the world and what it allows the world to see. The management of sensitive information has been, throughout the long history of the House of Windsor, not merely a communication strategy, but a survival mechanism. Secrets have been kept, documents have been managed, and uncomfortable truths have been buried, with a consistency and a sophistication that reflects generations of accumulated institutional knowledge about what exposure costs and what discretion preserves. Camilla's files do not exist in a vacuum. They exist within a tradition of sensitive information that stretches back decades inside the royal family and that has shaped some of the most consequential moments in its modern history. The precedents are instructive. The years surrounding the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage produced a volume of sensitive material, recorded conversations, private letters, and personal testimonies that shaped public perception of the monarchy in ways the institution is still managing today. Diana's own decision to cooperate with Andrew Morton's biography, published in 1992, demonstrated with devastating clarity what the release of private royal information could do to the carefully maintained image of an institution that depended on public trust for its legitimacy. The damage from that episode took years to fully absorb, and the lesson the palace drew from it, insiders say, was not simply that information needed to be better controlled. It was that the people closest to the monarchy's most sensitive secrets represented its greatest vulnerability. That lesson has been applied with varying degrees of success in the decades since. The royal family has become considerably more sophisticated in its management of information, more attentive to the risks posed by those within its circle who accumulate sensitive knowledge, and more deliberate in the way it structures relationships to minimize the possibility of damaging disclosures. But sophistication has its limits, and the fundamental vulnerability that Diana's cooperation with Morton exposed, namely that the most dangerous threats to the monarchy come not from external enemies but from within its own intimate circle, has never been fully resolved. It has simply been managed, and management, as the current crisis demonstrates, is not the same as resolution. What makes Camilla's situation particularly resonant within this history is the degree to which it inverts the pattern that previous episodes have followed. In most of the monarchy's encounters with the threat of sensitive disclosure, the person holding the dangerous information has been someone who is in the process of being pushed out of the inner circle, someone whose leverage derived precisely from the fact that they had nothing left to lose by using it. Diana was separated from Charles and increasingly isolated from the institutional support of the palace when she chose to speak. The dynamic that gave her information its power was the dynamic of someone who had already lost the position she was trying to protect. Camilla's situation is the opposite. She is not on the outside looking in. She is the queen consort, the second most senior figure in the monarchy, a woman whose position within the institution is formally secure and publicly acknowledged. The threat she represents is therefore not the threat of someone with nothing to lose. It is the threat of someone with everything to protect and the means to enforce that protection. That distinction makes her leverage considerably more complex and considerably more difficult for the institution to neutralize through the methods it has historically used to manage sensitive insiders. The weight of secrets inside the House of Windsor is not, in the end, simply about the specific contents of any particular file or the specific details of any particular private communication. It is about the cumulative burden of an institution that has chosen consistently and deliberately to manage its most difficult realities through concealment rather than confrontation. That burden does not disappear, it accumulates. And when it finally finds its way to the surface, as it periodically does, the damage it causes is always proportional, not just to what is revealed, but to how long it was hidden. The monarchy is now facing the consequences of that accumulation. And the summit Charles called was only the beginning of what promises to be a very long reckoning. What the summit means for the future of the monarchy. When the emergency summit ended and the senior royals who had been summoned to that room returned to their separate households and their carefully maintained public schedules, the British monarchy looked, from the outside, exactly as it always does, composed, unified, impervious to the kind of internal pressure that would visibly destabilize any other institution. The public appearances continued, the charitable engagements proceeded, the photographs released to a waiting press showed a family performing its duties with the practiced ease of people who have been doing this for their entire lives. But those with knowledge of what had taken place inside that summit room say that the monarchy that emerged from those closed doors was not the same institution that had entered them. Something had shifted, and the implications of that shift are only beginning to become clear. The most immediate consequence of the summit, according to insiders, was not a resolution, but a realignment. The gathering did not produce a settlement between Charles and Camilla. It did not result in the files being surrendered, or the threat being formally withdrawn. What it produced instead was a temporary and deeply uneasy stabilization, the kind that occurs when two parties in a serious conflict each conclude that the cost of immediate escalation outweighs the benefit and agree, without warmth and without genuine reconciliation, to step back from the edge for the time being. That kind of stabilization is fragile by nature. It holds only as long as both parties believe that restraint serves their interests better than action. And the conditions that produce the original threat have not been resolved. They have simply been paused. And a pause inside the royal family is never the same as peace. For the long-term future of the monarchy, the significance of this episode extends well beyond the immediate dispute between Charles and Camilla. It raises fundamental questions about the sustainability of the institutional model that the House of Windsor has operated under for generations. A model in which sensitive information is managed through discretion and loyalty rather than through genuine transparency, in which the most dangerous vulnerabilities are kept close rather than addressed openly, and in which the people with the greatest knowledge of the institution's private realities are also the people whose cooperation is most essential to its public image. That model has served the monarchy well for a very long time, but it is a model whose continued viability depends on the loyalty of the people inside it remaining more powerful than the grievances they accumulate. And grievances, as the current crisis demonstrates, have a way of accumulating faster than loyalty can absorb them. King Charles is a man governing an ancient institution while managing a serious illness, navigating a marriage under extraordinary strain, and attempting to hold together a family whose divisions have never been more visible or more consequential. The emergency summit was his attempt to assert control over a situation that had moved beyond the boundaries of what normal palace management could contain. Whether that attempt succeeded in any meaningful long-term sense is something that only time will reveal. What it unquestionably demonstrated is that the monarchy under Charles is operating in conditions of internal stress that represent a genuine challenge to the stability of his reign and to the long-term credibility of the institution he has spent his entire life preparing to lead. What the summit also revealed, with uncomfortable clarity, is the degree to which the personal and the institutional have become dangerously entangled within the current royal household. In a healthy institution, private disputes between individuals, however senior, are managed in ways that prevent them from compromising the integrity of the broader structure. Mechanisms exist for containing conflict, for separating personal grievances from institutional decision-making, and for ensuring that the functioning of the organization does not become hostage to the emotional temperature of its most powerful members. Inside the House of Windsor, those mechanisms have always been less formal and less reliable than the institution's polished exterior suggests. But the current crisis has exposed their inadequacy in a way that is difficult to paper over. The people around Charles who are most invested in the long-term stability of the monarchy are, according to sources, deeply aware that the summit represented a warning as much as a response. A warning that the internal culture of the institution, its reliance on secrecy, its tolerance of expanding personal influence, and its instinct to manage rather than resolve its most serious internal conflicts, has created conditions in which the loyalty that holds everything together can no longer be taken for granted. The files that Camilla holds are a symptom of that cultural failure as much as they are a cause of the current crisis. They exist because the institution created the conditions in which accumulating leverage became a rational response to feeling threatened within the very family one had devoted oneself to serving. There is also the question of what this crisis means for the reign that follows. Prince William is watching the current situation with the careful attention of a man who understands that every decision made and every precedent set during his father's reign will shape the conditions he inherits. The divisions exposed by the summit, the questions raised about the management of royal estates, the visibility of competing power centers within the household, and the fragility of the loyalty structures that the institution depends upon are all challenges that William will face in an intensified form if they are not addressed meaningfully during Charles's reign. Sources close to William say he understands this with complete clarity, and that understanding is one of the reasons he has been so careful to avoid being drawn into the current conflict in any way that could compromise his ability to address its root causes from a position of authority when the time comes. The files remain. The divisions within the family remain, and the questions raised by this crisis about who truly holds power inside the House of Windsor, and on what terms that power is exercised, remain entirely unanswered. The summit that nobody was supposed to know about has become the most revealing window into the modern monarchy that this generation has yet been offered. And what it reveals is an institution navigating the distance between the image it projects and the reality it inhabits with less certainty and less stability than at any point in recent memory. The crown endures, but the cost of that endurance has never been more plainly visible. Do you believe Camilla would truly release those files? Or is this a threat designed purely to protect her position? The monarchy has survived centuries of crisis, but has it ever faced one quite this close to its own heart?